Go ahead.
All right. This is Rick Funston with the University of Nebraska, and I'm going to be speaking to you today about some of our heifer development work. For those of you who aren't familiar with the university system, I'm at the West Central Research and Extension Center, which is our oldest research center, which is in North Platte, Nebraska, which is right here. A lot of the work I'm going to talk about has been conducted up at the Goodmanson Sandhills Laboratory, as well as the research center here at North Platte, and the other stars are just locations that we have other beef cattle work going on within the university system. The Goodmanson Ranch is about a 13,000-acre ranch. We run about 700 Red Angus Simmental composite cows, use composite bulls on those animals. Unfortunately, it didn't look like this much of the year due to the drought, but it's a combination of sandhills and meadows, which make for a good combination of cool season and warm season grazing in most years. A lot of the work we do at Goodmanson is known as beef systems work, which we look at opportunities or management strategies to help producers be more profitable, such as winter grazing or supplementation, early weaning, some of those things, but not just at the immediate impact of that decision on a short point in time, but on taking a systems approach in which those decisions are followed clear through the entire system to understand how impacts of winter nutrition might impact the animals postnatally. Some of our fetal programming work many of you are familiar with or at least heard about, where we've shown that gestational nutrition can impact the animal's feed efficiency, can impact carcass characteristics and feedlot steer performance even before those animals are born. Today I want to talk about some of our heifer development work within our systems research. I think we've all seen this slide about our decreasing cow numbers, and that cow numbers are at numbers equal to back in the 1950s. I think the big thing to consider, though, is how much beef are we producing out of that smaller cow herd. And I think this says a lot for what we've been able to do with technology, with reproductive management, increasing percent of weaned calves, and a lot of the things going on in the feedlot to make animals bigger. We're dealing with heavier carcasses than ever. I do like to point out, though, this is not sustainable to keep decreasing cow numbers and maintaining or increasing pounds out of that system, because we're running up against constraints of genetics and constraints of the packing industry as far as regarding being able to handle those bigger carcasses. And I think some of the economists this year say that our beef production will be down next year because of decreasing cow numbers. The packing plants have responded, as much as they can. We sent some cattle a couple weeks ago and didn't get discounted until 1,050 pounds. And that is a big, big feedlot animal. There are two ways that we can address increasing cow numbers. Perhaps beef production output, there's a whole list of things perhaps we can look at. But reproduction within our existing cow herd. And if we increase our percent pregnancy rate across the entire cow herd, if you do the math on the numbers of cows and a percent increase, that's rather dramatic. The other thing we can do is keep back more heifers. And that really leads into what my talk is about. When you keep back those heifers, how do we manage them with all-time record high feed prices? The feedlots, to a large extent, aren't letting people keep back a lot of heifers because they're bidding really high prices for them. So there isn't a lot of heifer retention. Some of our heifers at Goodmanson, and again, those are composite Red Angus Simmental primarily. This would be what they look like at pregnancy diagnosis. Some very animals with a lot of volume and real functional animals for the sandhills or anywhere that we'd want to take these. I'll tell you they probably don't look that good coming off some of the treatments we have where they're on winter grass grazing from weaning till breeding, or grazing corn residue, and we'll talk about some of that work. But before I do that, just want to make a couple comments on some slides that Jim Gosey shared with me some time ago about his replacement heifer selection criteria. And I want to show these because they kind of agree with some of our biases or results from our research. He says to call the daughters of bad marked cows. And what are they? They're cows that need help calving, that calve late, that fail to wean a calf, that have problems nursing a calf, that wean a light calf, or cows that have attitude problems. Beyond that, call lightweights, big birth, and frame cattle. Call the youngest. Call those animals that were born in the last part of your calving period. Select daughters of oldest cows, and a lot of people would maybe disagree with that because we're often told the best genetics should be in our younger animals if we're making any genetic improvement. But from a functionality standpoint and to be able to measure reproduction, we probably can't select for that. So by selecting for animals that are maintained in a herd for quite a while, they're probably selecting for fertility, at least indirectly. Optimum, not maximum preg rates, and our work would definitely agree with that. I don't think we want every heifer pregnant. If we're getting every heifer pregnant that we expose, we're not putting much pressure on them to challenge them to get into the breeding herd. Pigmented eyes and udder, form, depth, the rib, chest width, and guts. A cow or a potential cow that can eat a lot of poor quality feedstuffs. You don't see anything in there for any EPDs or numbers to look for. It's all on functionality, and I would certainly agree with that. There certainly is basis for some of the recommendations that have been made for the most appropriate target weight. This work was done, though, back in the 1960s. And you see these animals that were at 65 versus 55% of mature weight at breeding. The heavier animals had more conceive early, better overall preg rate, and less dystocia than those that were less developed. But again, keep in mind, these animals are today's cattle. So there hasn't been a whole lot of work done since then up to maybe the last 5 or 10 years to really challenge this paradigm. And even if we want to get to some target weight that we're comfortable with, I tell people, let's do the math first. We got different genetics. A lot of us are weaning 500-pound calves, heifers even, at November. And then we think about when we're going to breed them. If we're in a spring calving system, even May 1st, which is probably a pretty early breed date for a lot of people, we got a long time. We have 180 days. And if we want to put, get them to 750 where we're comfortable breeding, we got to put 250 pounds on them. It's not a lot of gain. A pound and 4/10. I would argue a heifer rarely has to gain more than a pound and a half a day to even get at target weights that might be recommended from older literature, which I'm going to argue may not be pertinent today. So a lot of the work had focused on how we get there, on what pattern of growth do we use to get to that 2/3 of mature weight. And this shows 3 different feeding regimens, if you will, a high, then a maintenance going into breeding, kind of a steady rate of gain, or a low, then a high. Some work done here at North Platte showed no difference in age of puberty, conception rate, or calf performance. Some work in Kansas showed this even gain versus the late gain, the blue bar. Using the late gain, they did it with 12% less feed. And first service conception rate in the late gain was considerably greater than if you just kept those heifers on an even gain going into breeding. So there really is this flushing effect on reproduction in cattle, and we have several examples of this, and this is just one of them, moving animals from a lower to a higher plane of nutrition going into breeding and actually getting a better response in this system with less feed. If we look at longevity, how many animals are still in the herd at 5 years of age based on their heifer development feeding program? We talked about these 3. But if we look at this low-high, which was the blue bar previously, we see more animals in the herd from 2, 3, 4, 5 years of age. And I think a lot of this has to do with, adaptability and behavior. That those animals that are on that low plane of nutrition were either not fed enough to gain better than they did, or they were fed something of a poorer quality. And that's what all of our work is focused on. It's not limiting intake, but it's limiting the quality of feedstuffs. So there could be huge implications of having these heifers developed in an environment that we're going to want them to, or provide them as cows. And that low plane of nutrition is something that we're all familiar with, especially if we winter graze at all. Now, if we look at the reverse, perhaps in the industry, in perhaps some cases where people get heifers fleshy. This study was done in Minnesota, and they had heifers made that were either condition score 7 or 5, and then they restricted them until they quit cycling, and they had to go to a 3 to stop cycling, and then refed them to see when they started cycling again. And you can see these fatter heifers had to get a full condition score greater to cycle than these heifers that were just maintained at a 5. And I think that raises an interesting question. Can we program heifers to be, as older animals, dependent on a certain amount of fatness to breed? And there's certainly some hormones that would imply that may be possible. So some of the first work in this line of research was actually started by Gene Deitcher shortly before I came here. And they developed heifers either to 53 or 58% of mature weight. 45-day breeding season data were collected through the 4th pregnancy diagnosis. And if we just look at some of that data, we see no difference in preg rate clear out to the 4th pregnancy diagnosis. And no difference in calf production. Everything was very similar. Lowering that even more in a series of a couple-year study to 50% of mature weight. And if I might clarify what weight that is, our mature cow weight at Goodmanson is 1,200 pounds in the fall at November weaning. So we're talking about a 6-weight heifer or something slightly greater. We did allow these animals longer breeding season that were developed lighter, thinking they may not have been puberal. Preg rate was the same, but this was with a 15-day longer breeding season. Calving date, you can see, is a little bit later in these lighter heifers. Birth weight's not different. Preg weight with the second calf, these cattle were still lighter with the second calf. And in the previous study, we were able to follow those heifers out to their 4th pregnancy diagnosis, and they were still lighter. And that was dependent upon how they were developed as a heifer calf. Second preg rate was not different either. So the next study we did, thinking that perhaps some of the lighter heifers weren't puberal yet, and some work out of Miles City would indicate if you breed a heifer that's only cycled once versus 3 times, preg rate's going to be less. And we put an embryo in an animal that's only cycled once versus 3 times, embryo survival was less. Would maybe challenge that. We think that may not be entirely true today. But certainly, this study showed it. But again, this study was done maybe 30 years ago. So what we did in the next study was feed MGA for 14 days, and then we waited 13 days and turned the bulls in, thinking, and that was with half of each of all the heifers that were developed to 50% of mature weight, thinking that perhaps if there weren't a lot cycling that we could stimulate their cyclicity with MGA. And if we look at what happened, the heifers on both treatments were, as designed, the same weight. And this was about a month before breeding when we bled them to determine cycling status. They're very similar numbers cycling, so would we expect MGA to have a stimulatory effect? And it didn't. So birth dates, everything was the same in this study. So those studies were designed providing certain quality of feedstuffs that we knew what rate of gain we would get. in a more confined situation. The next series of studies, we looked at heifer development systems, looking at a grazing scenario. And as you can guess there, there's a lot of corn residue in Nebraska, and fortunately we're able to graze quite a bit of it. This first study, we either had heifers on winter grass or corn residue, and these were Goodmanson heifers. 3-year study, there were about 300 heifers. We did have a treatment around the time of breeding that I'm not going to have time to talk about today, but there's some interesting things going on, especially in the later calving herd, that we may need to supplement animals, not just during development, but maybe around breeding, which sometimes we forget. And I will touch on that at the end. Again, some of the heifers, we synchronize all our animals, all our heifers and our cows in natural service by turning the bulls in, and then 5 days later, everything gets a shot of prostaglandin. So some work out of Miles City in a 32-day breeding season at Fort Keogh with over 3 years, they had greater than 85% preg rate. This is something that's pretty easy to do, and it can have huge returns. Those cattle that are synchronized are older and heavier at weaning. We went from a 60-day breeding season to a 45-day in 1 year, and the 45-day was with synchronization. We shortened the breeding season 15 days, and we virtually had the same preg rate. And what did that do to the bottom line? We made those calves that were out of synchronized cows were older and heavier at weaning, and it returned, $35 a head for that one shot of prostaglandin. And to show further the importance of having animals calve early in the calving season, this is some of our steer data where steers born in the first cycle, heavier at weaning, heavier carcass weight, greater marbling scores, and overall profitability was greater percent upper two-thirds choice as well. And if we look at the heifers born in the first cycle are heavier at weaning, heavier pre-breeding, more cycling before breeding, greater preg rate, and more calve in the first 21 days. Remember back to one of the first slides on Jim Gosey's recommendations on keeping heifers. He said to cull the heifers that are born late. And I think often we don't make our culling decisions till weaning, and we forgot when that calf maybe was born. And a big mistake I think we can make is, and for years we've told people to get rid of the big ones, get rid of the small ones, and keep the middle cut. Well, if they're big because they're born early and out of a moderate cow, I think we made a mistake. So I'd argue, probably on the side of Jim Gosey, that everything we need to know about keeping replacement heifers probably happens at birth rather than at weaning when we select them. Probably most importantly, having animals that calve early in that calving season, the chance they'll be open the next year is much less than if they calve, clear out here late in the calving season. And it takes a profit from 2 early calvers to cover the loss of 1 late calver, and a cow that calves in her first cycle her entire life of 8 or 9 calves will produce the equivalent of 1.5 to 2 more calves. And I think it needs to be pointed out that is on the same resources. Doesn't cost you any more depending on when she calves, but her return is huge depending on when she calves. So back to the study, heifers developed on winter range were heavier than heifers on corn residue. This is opposite of what we see on cows. We see cows gain better on corn residue than winter range, and I think part of this is it's a learned behavior. We had less cycling on corn residue than winter range. Here's what they gained. Over winter, half a pound or less, and then look what they did when they went from coming home on stalks to turned in with the bulls, and then from turned in with the bulls to pregnancy diagnosis. We saw this compensatory gain being expressed in these heifers that were on stalks before. Body weight That preg check was still heavier for those on winter range, but they were catching up by the time prior to calving. And overall, no difference in pregnancy rates. 85% cost about the same money to get a pregnant heifer. And I would argue if your preg rates are above that, you're probably not challenging your animals. And I would certainly rather challenge them when they're a profitable stocker animal that I have an option with to sell them as a yearling compared to getting her bred and then find out I put too much feed into her and she didn't breed back as a first calf heifer. We've been asked, well, does this only apply to crossbred animals that inherently have higher fertility? Well, this is some work we did here at North Platte where these are with more straight Angus cattle developed in the dry lot or corn residue, and then we had some treatments after or around breeding. Again, I'm not going to have time to touch on them too much, but I will talk a little bit about the importance of nutrition post-breeding. Some of the heifers, and again, they're commercial, mostly Angus cattle, and by design, the heifers in the dry lot were 110 pounds heavier at breeding, less cycling in the ones developed on corn residue. And here's just the gains over time. During the winter period on stocks, those black cattle gained just under a pound. Those in the dry lot were over 2.5 pounds. And then these were when they came home from stocks. And they were in the same pen. You see those heifers in the same pen, on the same ration, outgained those heifers that were developed in the dry lot. The other thing we see is going to grass, those heifers that were developed on stocks outgained the heifers that were locked up in the same pasture. And I think this is very important to establishment of pregnancy. So here's the weight before going to stocks as a bred heifer. And if we just look at this a minute, here's the heifer calves developed on corn stalks as these are bred heifers going to stocks, but they were developed on corn stalks as heifer calves. If we look over the winter period, they gained a little bit. What those on the dry lot do on stocks as a bred heifer, they lost weight. So no difference in synchronization rate. We had a little bit lower AI conception rate on the heifers on stocks. Final preg rate was the same. And I would still say very acceptable AI conception rate. Just to point out this gain post-breeding, these heifers were on stocks. And this was another study we're in the middle of now. Heifers on stocks, heifers in the dry lot. Just some gains getting up to breeding, to pre-breeding. Those that were on stocks bred better. AI conception rate was considerably greater with a lighter heifer. How could that be? Well, if we look at pre-breeding gain, these dry lot heifers were gaining a lot more. But post-breeding gain, these heifers, these lighter heifers, when they went to grass, outgained these. Just to illustrate that further, heifers on stocks, 9/10 of a pound, in a dry lot, 1.5 pounds, and then when they went to grass, in the same pasture, these heifers that were developed on stocks outgained these in the dry lot by 1 pound a day. And we're finding other evidence that post-breeding gain or nutritional status, however it's being delivered, if that gain is because of how they were managed as a heifer calf or if it's additional nutrients, that post-breeding nutrition is very important to embryonic survival and probably key to why we can get these lighter heifers bred just as well as the heavier heifers, because they will outgain those heifers locked up. And again, this may be reserved for at least a breeding season where animals are actually gaining weight. And we'll talk about that as we wrap up. I mentioned that the heifers developed on stocks. So these are heifers developed on stocks and then as pregnant heifers, they were put with some naive cattle. And this middle bar, these are heifers that were developed on stocks that were put on stocks as bred heifers. And I guess all the point I would make here is heifers developed on corn stalks will outgain heifers developed that are naive or in a mixed population. They will outgain as bred heifers on corn stalks. So there's a lot of learned behavior that we can expose our heifer calves to based on how we're going to manage them later in life. So I think it's real important that we develop heifers in a system that we want them to exist on as a cow. We've looked at feed efficiency based on how we develop heifers, and we're just in the middle of that right now. But some indication those heifers that are developed on stocks are more efficient as bred heifers. So we've been able to lower development costs, and this slide needs to be updated because feed went up a bunch since I made this by $100 or more. And we've seen that selling open heifers was profitable if we run them as stockers. A lot of time people don't take that mindset, though, that they put a lot of money in the heifers because they'll only keep as many as we need for replacements. I do believe that by challenging animals with a short breeding season and lighter breeding weights, we can have animals that are more adaptable to the environment they're going to be expected to exist on. And we see lighter animals at least out to the 4th pregnancy diagnosis. I do think, as I pointed out before, these animals have to continue to grow through calving because as you saw from some of our puberty data, there's a lot of heifers that aren't cycling at the beginning of the breeding season. And I think some of the success in this program is that they're going to pastures for a spring calving herd in which they're exhibiting a lot of compensatory gain. Just to further illustrate that, we started a May herd here a few years ago, and we had 2 treatments of the heifers over winter, and this was from January until May. We either fed hay and all the hay they could eat and 4 pounds of a 30% cake, or meadow and 1 pound of cake. And then this was the weight at preg check. These heifers were, 70 pounds heavier or more? And here's the preg rates. Not very good. And these heavier heifers didn't breed all that well. So this last year, we took the 2 overwinter treatments, the higher rate of gain or the lower rate of gain, and we supplemented half of them 10 days before the breeding season through the breeding season with a pound of a 30% cake. And as you can see in the 2 supplemented groups, very similar preg rate. But as you can also see in the 2 non-supplemented groups, very similar preg rate, but about 20% or more lower. So it didn't do you any good to get that heifer at a heavier breeding weight at the beginning of the breeding season in this later calving herd, because what she's experiencing is a decreasing plane of nutrition during breeding, and the intervention isn't in the heifer development system, it's during the breeding system. And I think this is a new mindset that we're having to look at or take in these later calving herds with the high-risk animals. Those first calf heifers and probably second calvers and our heifer calves probably need additional nutrients during breeding. And I might point out, this bottom study was during a drought, but this was not. This was when we had a lot of forage, and we still saw it 20 to 30% lower preg rates than we saw in our spring herd. So why the difference? Well, if we think about scroll circumference and then how it relates to puberty in bulls' daughters,
these animals out here back in the 70s, when some of this work was first done, saying we needed to have heifers at 2/3 of mature weight, you know, it was pretty flat until the early 90s, and then there's been a real dramatic increase in scrotal circumference. And this may explain part of the story, that as we increase scrotal circumference, the effect of daughters reaching puberty sooner. The other thing is we got a different type of animal than we had back in the 60s and 70s in a lot of other respects as well. So with that, here's our beef website, beef.unl.edu. You can do a search on heifer development, my last name, get a lot more details on some of these studies, or you can go down here to reports and look at our beef reports. I think we got a couple of our heifer development articles in this year's beef report, which is online. Another website I'd like to point out as I finish up is beefrepro.info. It is our applied reproductive strategies and beef cattle website, which we keep here at North Platte. We just had a conference at Sioux Falls early December, and those proceedings will be put up shortly. But if you want to get to them now, just go to resources and then go to proceedings, and then click on the Joplin or Boise meeting from last year, and that'll take you to the applied reproduction website of Angus Source. And then finally, here's my email address, rfunston2@unl.edu. If you have any questions that you want to email me, I'll be happy to get back to you. And apologize for my voice, but I've had a cold for the past week. So thank you.